BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, the costs of clearing up after being culled out with bird flu.
To be honest, it's been such an emotional rollercoaster. I just can't bring myself to think of putting myself through that again.
Sir James Dyson on farming and inheritance tax.
Well, there's much better ways to avoid inheritance tax than spend 140 million trying to make farms work. So that's ridiculous.
And Trump's trade tariffs. What do they mean for world trade and us?
Just the chaotic nature. And that makes it incredibly difficult for businesses to plan ahead and make decisions.
Let's start, though, with new rules for the pig supply chain, which are due to be introduced this spring to help even up what DEFRA describes as a power imbalance between farmers and processors. The rules have been developed after a crisis in the industry caused by a combination of Brexit and COVID, when back in 2021, a shortage of staff at processing sites left farmers unable to send their pigs for slaughter. So even though farmers had contracts with processors, the pigs stayed on farm, costing extra to feed and getting too big for supermarket spec. Well, food supply chains are something we've been focusing on all week on Farming Today. That's here on BBC Radio 4 every weekday morning at 5:45 and available during the hours of daylight on BBC Sounds. Anna Hill went to meet outdoor pig farmer and chair of the National Pig Association, Rob Mutimer, on his farm in Norfolk.
I think if you look back to 2019, a lot of our contracts were dubious, to say the least. They weren't well worded. Wasn't things written down. A lot of it was nearly done on a fag packet, and it's strange. And the handshake used to work well for many people, but considering now that we're dealing with multinational companies, it's not like dealing with someone you've known all your life who's got a small slaughterhouse up the road. I mean, we deal with a multinational company, and we must have proper contracts that are well worded so it works for both parties.
You've been working on it quite closely. What sort of things do you need?
It's really just to tighten up on how contracts are worded. We're not looking to restrict the flow of pigs or change the market. We're just looking to make sure that these contracts actually do make a difference, and when things are difficult, that there is protection for both parties. In the contracts it should say, if I don't meet what the processor requires, this is what should happen, and if they don't take the pigs that I actually am producing, this is what should happen.
Transparency, that's the word, isn't it?
Yeah, transparency. And there's also got to be wordings in the contract for force majeure. I mean, if, and touch wood, it doesn't happen, we get hit by foot and mouth or something like that, that sends the markets into a spiral, and you can't expect the markets to work normally at that stage.
Tell me a little bit about that supply chain from the farmer to the processor to the shop.
Yeah, well, it is a three-stage supply chain, and the slight reservation I have about the review is the fact that it doesn't include everyone within the supply chain. I would like to have seen the supermarkets included in the supply chain as well, because there's us and the processor and then to the supermarkets. That is one of our regrets, but we are very pleased that we will now have a review of how the producers work with the processors. There's only really 3 or 4 major processors left in the country. So that are the issues, and that's why the supply chain review was needed so badly. But what we're not trying to do is we're not trying to write contracts that are set in steel. There must be, people still got to be able to negotiate their own contracts as to what they want. But there's just the government of putting forward things that should go in that contract to actually protect both sides when the market's unstable.
Then I caught up with Ash Gilman, Director of Agricultural Strategy at Cranswick, one of the UK's largest pork processors, at a rather noisy Norfolk farming conference.
I think the regulation, we welcome. We're absolutely supportive of it, and we'll work with government as best we can, to make it work. The important thing that we recognise is that the crisis post-COVID that caused all the labour shortage happened then, and there was a lot of emotion in the sector. We've never been hit by such a shock ever. The industry's already squared up, recognised how it needs to align, put more sort of cost of production type based contracts in place. The industry's already done a lot of that alignment and actually gone further in terms of looking at what producers need to deliver in the future.
Ash Gilman from the processors Cranswick. We asked the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs why supermarkets haven't been included in the new supply chain rules. A spokesperson told us our new regulations will correct the power imbalance between pig farmers and the businesses they supply, which for most producers are processors rather than retailers. We also support the work already undertaken by the Groceries Code Adjudicator, which is responsible for regulating the relationship between the UK's 14 largest grocery retailers and their direct suppliers by enforcing the Grocery Supply Chain Code of Practice. Now, if you live in the countryside, it may not come as much of a surprise that broadband speeds in rural areas are 26% slower than they are in urban areas. That's according to the government. And that there are still parts of the country that have no mobile phone access at all. Well, these are just two of the areas the government aims to tackle in its Digital Inclusion Action Plan. It recently published the first steps. Ministers also aim to improve the digital skills of the 7.3 million people, that's 18% of the population, who say they lack the minimum essential digital skills for work, and the 3.8 million people who lack the essential digital skills for life. Kaz Graham asked Chris Bryant, the Minister with responsibility for digital inclusion, how they're going to deliver those skills to rural Britain.
One of the things that we're doing is we're setting up an innovation fund so that local authorities in different parts of the country, and my guess is that quite a few rural areas are going to take us up on this, can come to us and say, look, the single most important thing we could do to tackle digital exclusion in this particular area is, run projects around skills for older people, or it might be people who work in particular industries.
Yeah, well, we would say, I guess, that giving people these essential skills for working digitally is, of course, really valuable, but it's not much use for those farmers and workers in remote rural areas where reliable internet connection just still isn't a given.
Aha. Which is why, of course, first of all, we've got Project Gigabit, which is rolling out decent broadband, by which I mean gigabit-capable broadband. And I know the vast majority of people in the country haven't the faintest idea what the difference is between 2 megabits per second and 1,000 megabits per second. But it is basically the difference between the Wheel of Doom, that circling thing going round and round, which means you can't get anything done, being there on your screen or not. So we're rolling out gigabit-capable broadband to everywhere across the country. 99% of properties is what we're aiming for by 2030. £2 billion worth of money we've invested in that. But we also need to make sure that there's a proper mobile signal.
Yeah, I mean, people living in rural areas have broadband speeds that are 26% slower than in urban areas. And there are still places that can't receive any mobile reception. I mean, that's in the text of your action plan. How are you going to turn that around? Because it's proved really difficult for previous governments. What are you going to do differently?
So, first of all, we've got a significant amount of extra investment coming from the private sector for mobile masts. Secondly, I think we need to change the law to make it easier for people to roll out masts. That sometimes it's about planning decisions which take far too long and make it difficult in rural areas. But I'm very conscious. I represent an area in South Wales in the valleys, the Rhondda and Ogmore, which is essentially 4 valleys. And I know precisely these problems. It's difficult geography. One of the things I've tried to focus things on a bit more is instead of just putting masts on the top of mountains, why don't we just make sure that we track where people actually live and work?
How do you get around the lack of reliability? Because I think that's the thing that causes people in rural areas real problems. We hear from farmers who, they lose their broadband connection halfway through a form that they need to fill in for DEFRA, for example. It goes, they lose everything. We hear from farmers who've diversified. It can take them ages to pick up a signal to take a cash-free payment, say at a farmer's market, all kinds of things like that.
Or upload a photograph of the new yurts that they've put in the field or whatever it may be, so that they've got a decent tourism offer as well. No, I fully understand all of these issues. That's why, as I say, we're determined to make sure that there's better connectivity. We're aiming to get to 5G standalone, which will be much more reliable than that what we have at the moment. But I've also been saying to Ofcom, I'm sure this is something that your listeners will have heard many, many times, or will have said to you. They'll have said, well, Well, theoretically, it says that we've got 99% mobile coverage from all 4 mobile operators, but I can't get a signal, and I'm waving my phone around all over the place. I've leant out the bathroom window, and I still can't get a signal. And that is because I think Ofcom's reporting has not been as reliable as people would like. That's one of the things I'm determined to change.
Chris Bryant, the Minister for Digital Inclusion. Bird flu continues to hit poultry farms across the country, with 41 cases in England, 4 in Northern Ireland and 1 in Scotland. Poultry farmers in a number of areas across England must now keep their birds indoors, and all farmers are being asked to maintain high biosecurity measures. Well, last week we heard from Jerry Saunders from Orchard Organic Farm in South Devon about the emotional toll of having all 5,000 of his birds culled after getting bird flu. The financial impact too can be severe. Well, earlier this week we caught up with Jerry, who told Anna more about the hidden costs of bird flu.
I mean, one obvious and immediate cost is that we had a lot of eggs in stock ready to deliver on the Monday morning. All of those, A, we couldn't sell, so that's circa £10,000 worth of eggs that couldn't be sold. And then B, we've had to pay for the privilege of getting those disposed of via a licensed route.
The government does provide some compensation. How much does that actually cover?
We have to negotiate with their valuer, but the reality is, if we're lucky, we think we'll get roughly half of what it would cost us to restock with hens anyway. But obviously the cost of the hen isn't the value of the hen. The value of our hens was the 300 eggs they were going to lay us.
What about insurance? Were you insured, and can you reinsure?
No and no. So the early days when avian flu was first sort of around, which was probably 8-10 years ago, insurance was readily available. Obviously, as the insurance companies have had to pay out more and more, it became harder and harder to get, to the point that for an organic outdoor setup like ours, we couldn't realistically get insurance. Some of the supermarket chains now, Waitrose, etc., very kindly are self-insuring or paying for insurance for their producers, because they're obviously very concerned about their supply chain. But for independent people like ourselves, it's extraordinarily hard to get.
I know that you have a 12-month quarantine period now. So what does this actually mean for you?
They draw a red line around our farm, and we are not allowed to move livestock, people, etc., in and out of that red line without very, very good reason, without strict protocol. So it closes us down in all sorts of other ways. We relied very heavily on our little farm shop here to pull in customers then who would buy our apples and buy our apple juice and bits and bobs. So, that sort of income is also lost. And the heart-wrenching part of it is that, we've built up to where we were, 5,000 laying hens, over approximately 15 years. And in doing so, you've got 15 years of relationships with your customers, and with people that have supported us for all of that time, coming to buy eggs here on the farm shop, etc. So to lose them and to upset them, it has been very, very difficult as well.
People have offered donations. How much difference will that make?
Oh, without a shadow of doubt, it's the difference between us, difference between ruin and survival. It'll allow us to pay those bills, which things like redundancy payments and all those sorts of bits, it'll allow us to pay those bills which we didn't have a pot of cash sat aside to deal with. And it's just amazing. And, you read down through the list and it reassures or relights your faith in sort of community and the public and hopefully some of that sort of 15 years of trying to sort of share our farm with people, it sort of has come back to sort of save us, if you like.
Are you going to go back into free-range eggs, do you think? Because a lot of people who've been hit by avian flu have had second thoughts themselves about doing this.
It's really difficult, because the reality is that to be up to where we were before would be 2 years' time. So the practicality is that obviously, whilst those customers have all been amazing, in 2 years they've got to have found other suppliers, etc. And to be honest, like say, 15 years of hard work, and it's been such an emotional roller coaster. I just can't at the moment bring myself to think of putting myself through that again. The farm is very, very quiet, and it's just, it saddens me every time I walk into one of the sheds and open the door and just, there's nothing there. So I've got a bit of healing possibly to do yet, I think.
Jerry Saunders in Devon. Right, let's talk about a farming operation which produces around 40,000 tonnes of wheat, 12,000 tonnes of potatoes, 29,000 tonnes of sugar beet, and also has 2,000 sheep and 800 cattle. Dyson Farming began in 2013 when the inventor and businessman James Dyson bought a farming estate in Lincolnshire. It's now the UK's biggest farming business, with 36,000 acres across Lincolnshire, Oxfordshire, West Berkshire, Somerset and Gloucestershire. Well, for This Natural Life earlier this week here on BBC Radio 4, Martha Kearney visited Sir James Dyson on his farm in Somerset to hear what the natural world means to him and how that's being reflected in his approach to farming.
We use GPS to guide our tractors and farm machinery, but also we have beacons. So we know where we are to within about 5 or 10 millimetres. And the marsh harrier nests in crops. So we fly drones over the field. And we plot where the marsh harrier is. So when we come to harvest the field, we avoid that spot.
So you tell me like a huge combine harvester can just go round a marsh harrier nest?
Exactly. To within 10 millimetres. In fact, you don't steer the vehicle at all. It guides itself. Obviously you have to stop it going into hedges and telegraph poles and that sort of thing. But it means you can plant crops much closer together. And if you can plant crops very close together, you can then plant wildflowers between the rows of crops.
What does that do?
Which is good for pollination and, again, fertiliser. So that sort of precision is really important. And we've got it with, we do have to spray for weeds, but we have a massive boom that's 40 foot long with cameras every half metre along it. And we're teaching the cameras to recognise a weed, tell the difference between a weed and a plant. And then we go just a sort of little zip when it sees a weed. So we're not spraying everything, we're just killing the weed, individual weeds. And that's the future of farming, I think, is to ideally not use chemicals at all. And we're developing something at Dyson to get us to that point. So using technology in farming is really important. And we're lucky because, as you know, I put about 140 million into our farms, not buying them, improving them, putting in drainage into the fields, repairing ditches, building tracks. So I'm lucky. I'm in a position to want to and can invest in the farms. But farmers can't do that. And, I don't believe in subsidies. I don't think we should have subsidies. If food is worth buying, people would pay the right price for food. But the problem is it isn't a level playing field because the EU subsidises farming, and America subsidises farming, Australia subsidises farming, and so on. So we're competing against imported subsidised food, and we're not subsidised any longer.
Well, some farmers would say one of the reasons that they're having a hard time is because they've lost those kinds of subsidies because of Brexit, which of course you supported.
I don't think it's right to have subsidies. I think people should pay whatever it costs to produce food. It's a mistake to subsidise, for the government to subsidise things.
But just looking at your ideal world where there aren't subsidies, wouldn't that mean the price of food in Britain would be going up and even more expensive and people are going to buy food from the EU?
We're doing our best on a scale and using technology to be more and more efficient as a farmer, but still producing very good food, better food actually, because the land is better looked after and better drained and so on. But you're paying taxes to pay those subsidies, which is mad. You're paying a tax which is then redistributed to farmers. Actually, it's not, because you only get it for nature things, not for actually growing food. They're even giving subsidies for
rewilding?
Yeah, rewilding, that's the word. They even give subsidies for rewilding, not for growing food, which we need. Rewilding is wasting the land, wasting food production.
And on the question of investment, you've had to face the accusation that you're only in this as a tax dodge to avoid inheritance tax.
Well, there's much better ways to avoid inheritance tax than spend 140 million trying to make farms work. So that's ridiculous.
Sir James Dyson. You can hear more from him and Martha on BBC Sounds. Just search for This Natural Life. The American President Donald Trump wants farmers in the US to produce more for the domestic market as the rows over import tariffs continue. Earlier this week, Mr. Trump imposed 25% tariffs on goods including agricultural produce from Canada and Mexico, and both countries are imposing retaliatory tariffs on American goods, as is China, which is the biggest market for US agriculture products. But a week is a long time in trade wars, and the Americans have now rolled back tariffs on Canada and Mexico. For instance, the rate on potash used to make fertiliser has gone from 25 to 10%. Mr. Trump says he'll delay higher tariffs on a range of goods until April. When such a huge player in the global markets makes changes on this scale, and more than once, there will surely be consequences for the rest of the world beyond America and its main trading partners. So what might all this mean for them, for us, and for global trade? Chris Southworth is Secretary-General at the International Chamber of Commerce.
Well, I think the first point to make is just the chaotic nature of the environment in which businesses are trying to operate. You know, one minute we're having tariffs imposed, the next minute there are exemptions, and that makes it incredibly difficult for businesses to plan ahead and make decisions when things are chopping and changing every day.
Earlier this week, President Trump tweeted aimed at farmers in the US, sort of implying that this is an opportunity for them. But they will also be getting impacts, won't they? Because, for instance, we've got tariffs with China, and that's where an awful lot of American soy goes.
Yeah. You know, at the end of the day, a tariff is a tax on the border. It's an import tax. It's US farmers who pay the import tax. So if you been planning your year ahead, you have your budget as a company, you'll have a plan for exports. What you won't have done is accommodated a tariff regime in the middle of the year. But you'll have to take on and absorb that cost. And then it's a question of how do you pass the cost on? You know, farms aren't highly profitable businesses quite often, especially the smaller farmers. You have to pass that cost on to your ultimate buyer or consumer.
There is a sort of knock-on effect around the world from all this. What does it mean for world trade, particularly in agricultural products?
The US today doesn't have the market power that it once had. It's 13% of global trade. So the rest of the world is talking about the other 87% and making sure that the trade is flowing around the global system. What's going on in the US is extremely disruptive to anybody who's doing business with the US, and certainly have an impact on the global economy. But you know, I think we shouldn't underestimate just how much the rest of the world don't want tariffs.
Here in the UK, the hope is that there will be a non-tariff agreement between the US and the UK. Obviously, that's a big assumption at this point. But is there actually an opportunity for farmers here to fill some of that American market now?
The difficulty with the US deal and farming, and this is one of the reasons why we don't have a deal. We tried twice to do deals with the US, free trade agreements. And one of those sticking points is food standards, chlorinated chicken, hormone beef. You know, UK consumers do not want those products in the shops. That's a show-stopping issue. Having said that, there is always scope for deals. It's all about political will and flexibility. My advice at the moment to government is, don't forget we're two big service economies, so we shouldn't be getting stuck on agriculture. What we need to do is be doing a digital economy agreement. We need to be thinking about finance and investment agreements where there is a lot of alignment with the US and huge opportunities. There's £1 trillion of investment that flows between our two economies. And then alongside, in parallel, having a longer conversation about a potential agricultural deal.
Because actually the DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed has already said very clearly, we will not be having hormone-treated beef. And from an American point of view, you've sort of ended the conversation before you've started it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been there twice. And in the process, we've wasted 10 years and still don't have a deal. And that's why I'm now advising to have two parallel tracks, which we have done with other countries, because we can move much faster on much bigger service opportunities than we can on areas like agriculture, which just need more time, more negotiation to figure out what is the world of the possible and acceptable to US businesses and UK consumers.
Chris Southworth from the International Chamber of Commerce. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer was Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.